Hello, everyone. Welcome to Nature and Science Podcast, where science does care what you believe. I'm your host, Don Murphy. We explore the science behind the latest technological developments, ask the deep questions about existence, and seek verifiable truth, leading to a clearer view of reality. On this episode, we explore how science is working to protect our national parks. Joining me is Dave Harmon, Executive Director of the George Wright Society. The George Wright Society supports parks, protected and conserved areas, cultural sites, and other kinds of place-based conservation by encouraging communication among and convenings of researchers, managers, educators, practitioners, and the public to facilitate informed discussions and actions that embrace our values. Dave Harmon is responsible for overseeing the Society's operations, including co-editing Park Stewardship Forum and helping plan workshops and other meetings. A member of the George Wright Society since 1985, Dave began working for the organization in 1990 and served as its executive director from 1998 to 2017, before returning to that role in 2019. He's active in the IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas. Dave, welcome to the program. It's good to have you here.
Yeah, it's good to be here, Don. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, so what started you on your park and conservation journey in the first place?
Well, I wouldn't say there was a single thing that started me on it. It just was as I was going through college and becoming a young adult and so forth, I was trying to sort of target where I thought my interests might go in terms of a career. And at the time, I was living in Los Angeles and working, not in the field of conservation. And it was my first time working and living in a large city, and I enjoyed it a lot. This was in 1980, a long time ago. But I also enjoyed on our weekends, oftentimes, going out into areas of California and getting up to places like Yosemite, Pinnacles, at that time a national monument, just various places, Mono Lake, things like that. And I realized there was a huge contrast between how I felt when I was in these places and how I felt when I was sort of inhabiting my urban self that I was living in Los Angeles, which was a part of me that was developing because I didn't grow up in a large city. I sort of grew up in a medium-sized city. But I realized that I was very interested in spending more time in places like that and finding out what really made them tick, not just to go there to, view the scenery and stuff, because I felt like I could see just by interacting with park rangers, other people who are working in conservation, that there was a lot going on behind the scenes. It sort of slowly dawned on me that I wanted to be part of that. And so it was just an overall maturation process, maybe you would say, as I was, just coming into my young adulthood.
Right. No, I understand. Well, you're heading up the George Wright Society, and this podcast is really all about understanding the George Wright Society. So why don't you tell us a bit about who George Wright was and the George Wright Society in the beginning? What is the George Wright Society?
Sure. Well, George Wright, whose full name was George Menendez Wright, was the first scientist to work in the U.S. National Park Service. He was active in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And he grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he was a graduate of UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, and from a very young age had a strong, strong interest in nature. He spent a lot of his boyhood and youth wandering around the Bay Area, going to different natural sites within the Bay Area. He was an avid birder and so forth. So he had that proclivity from the beginning. He was just a person who was interested in nature. And also, of course, he made it to places like Yosemite and other national parks when he was growing up, just by virtue of growing up in San Francisco. And so he decided he wanted to pursue a career with the Park Service. He got a job as a naturalist in Yosemite to start with. And his personal situation was such that both his parents had died during his childhood. He was raised actually by another relative. And his family, though, was wealthy. And so he had means. And and he was interested in wildlife, and he'd had a degree in forestry with a concentration in wildlife. And so when he got this job in Yosemite, he began formulating the idea of creating the first wildlife survey in U.S. national parks. This is, we're talking late 1920s. Remember, the National Park Service was created in 1916. The parks themselves have roots going back into the really 1870s and even before.
Sure.
At that time, it was a young agency. It was maybe 10, 11 years old when he was talking about this. And they didn't have any kind of program like that at all. They didn't know how many species were in parks. They didn't know what the populations of the species were. And more importantly, they treated species in a very different way than the parks do now. And in that they would, for example, dump garbage in places in national parks and have bear feeding shows where
Oh
they
yes,
literally,
I experienced that as a kid, as a 5 year old at Yosemite when my
yeah.
parents first took me there, along with the firefall that they also did.
Yep. Yeah, sort of spectacles like that where they push
Right.
burning brush off the edge of Yosemite and so forth. So it was a different kind of ethos in the Service. It was much more oriented towards creating these sort of spectacular experiences for people that didn't really have anything to do with nature, and not certainly nothing to do with understanding how the ecosystems of the park worked, because ecology was very young science at that time. And so the core thing that Wright achieved in his career was he financed out of his own pocket, because the Park Service didn't have the money to do it, the first wildlife surveys in the Western National Parks. And he convened a small research team, he and two other people who were both experienced naturalists. And they got a car rigged up, and they went all around to all the parks in a succession of different years to actually start finding out exactly what the wildlife was in the parks and how the wildlife was interacting, and what the Park Service's policies were doing to the wildlife in terms of, they were, at that time the Park Service would kill predators. If there was a wolf in a park someplace, the idea was to shoot it so that people would see more deer, more elk, more bison, or whatever it might be. And so all of that was a different way of managing the parks. And Wright and his efforts, and those of other people, transformed that into laying the groundwork of what we see today in parks, which is more scientific management, wildlife, and of course all the other park resources, whatever they might be. All of that science that goes on in parks today, all of the natural resource management, and to some extent the cultural resource management, had its roots in these kind of efforts, and Wright was a central figure in leading those. Yeah. So he was working again in the 1920s and 30s. He was a rising star in the National Park Service, and he ended up going into the headquarters in Washington, D.C., and he was beginning to get bigger and bigger assignments that affected policy throughout the whole parks and so on and so forth. And the last thing that he did was he was part of a international team that was assessing the Big Bend region, which is, of course, now a national park in Texas, and on the Rio Grande, the river that separates between Mexico and the U.S. There was a team. This was before Big Bend was a national park. They were assessing that area for park status, and they were also looking at possibly creating some Mexican counterpart protected areas on the other side of the border. And he was leaving that assignment and was going on to do another assessment in Arizona when, unfortunately and very tragically, he was killed in a car accident at the age of 31. So he was a
Mhm.
rising star whose flame was snuffed out much too soon. And that's
Well,
kind
it's
of
interesting that you mentioned Big Ben and his involvement there, and I just want our listeners to know we did an entire podcast on Big Ben
oh, great.
and the recent efforts to make much more of Big Ben a designated wilderness area. So
Mhm.
that's
Mhm.
something that it's interesting that dates back all the way to the 30s, and
Mhm.
with George Wright's initial assessments, that it's something that's been worked on for some time. It's a wonderful story of evolution of the system to tell.
It is, and what happened after he died is the science program kept on for a while, but his personality, which was by all accounts, he was one of these people who everybody liked, even the people who were disagreeing with him on policy. He was just a very likable person, and was just respected by a lot of people. After his sort of motive force of his personality was out of the picture because of his death, The science program languished. It sort of withered on the vine, and would only really be revived in the 1960s. So again, we're talking about him dying in 1936 was the year he died, and there was maybe 20, 25 years before what came to be known as the Leopold Report. That's another whole story. But anyway, science began sort of reawakening in the 1960s within the Park Service.
Right. Well, it points out, especially within this political climate where there seems to be an assault on not just on parks, but on science, how important it is. And I just did a recent blog and post on Facebook about the importance of science. And we did do a podcast in a series that touched on, for example, at Yellowstone National Park, the discovery of the thermophilic bacteria in that led to the polymerase chain reaction being able to be used in a very practical sense, both for the COVID test, the PCR test that people know about, but then it was extremely important in the criminal justice system because now you had a means for going in and looking at DNA evidence in a very practical way that didn't exist before the polymerase chain reaction or PCR, which
Hmm.
is directly traceable to the science which was done in Yellowstone. Because before this thermophilic, I'm sorry, bacteria
Yeah.
was discovered, the test was very sensitive to temperature, and they were able to find an enzyme which was temperature tolerant that made that test a lot more practical. And people need to understand, I mean, there are people that were literally set free from jail as a result of this test, again, which is directly traceable back to the science that was done in national parks. And
Yeah. I mean, and that is maybe one of the best stories that you can produce, and I'm glad you brought it up, Don, because what it tells you is not only are parks repositories for scientific research, they're excellent areas for doing that. It also just brings up the fact that these organisms that you're talking about that were living in the hot thermal pools there are not on anybody's, visitors aren't even knowing they're there, but they're part of that ecosystem. They're part of the biodiversity of the park, and the whole regimen of the Park Service putting emphasis on the entire ecosystem, not just the charismatic species that people come to see, but important as they are, right? But everything, and even things that seem insignificant, and like you just said, they turn out to be very significant, or it could be. And you don't find that out unless you have that overall emphasis, and you also have the opportunity, and you encourage science to happen. So Wright kind of, got that whole thing started in the Park Service.
well, I'm so glad we're talking about this, particularly in the context of this podcast being nature and science. And this is a great juxtaposition of nature and basic scientific research because much of the assault that we're hearing from a political point of view, uh, regardless of your political persuasion, there are people that don't understand why basic scientific research is important. And I just did another recent blog and post on Facebook about why basic scientific research is important because you just ask a question. Why
Hmm.
is this? What's going on here? It's born out of human curiosity. And many times the answer, like the case that we're talking about with the PCR test, lead to discoveries that have tremendous implications, positive implications for humanity as a whole. And
Yeah.
that's why we need to fund these kinds of things and continue to support these kinds of efforts. And it's telling and important that we're talking about George
Hmm.
Wright, who had the vision to begin to understand that we needed to marry, scientific research with our love for nature and see what we as human beings could understand in a deeper sense. So how did the society begin? How did the George
Hmm.
Wright Society then come to be?
Okay. Not surprisingly, it was two scientists who put together the idea for the organization. The George Wright Society we're not part of the National Park Service. We are a nonprofit organization that works with the Park Service and a lot of other agencies. The Park Service is not our only our only focus. But the people who founded it, as I just mentioned, were two scientists from the Park Service. They used to have a chief, what they called a chief scientist of the National Park Service. That position has been renamed something else. But in those days, we're talking the late 1970s, there was still that position. And two people who had held that position, who knew this history that we've just sort of quickly gone over, realized that the Park Service and other agencies could benefit from a nonprofit organization that is focused on this sort of background or baseline of information that are so important to the parks, scientific information. And because we're also an interdisciplinary group from the beginning, cultural resource-based information, scholarship in the humanities, history, archaeology, we do all of that. But the people who founded it were actually scientists, natural scientists, and the organization was founded in 1980. So we're coming up on, what is this, 45 years of being in existence. And the purpose of the group was to simply promote the creation, the dissemination, the sharing of all kinds of this scientific and other scholarly information that can be used for people for further research or to buttress resource management, to actually have practical implications right now in parks and other kinds of protected areas. So our group, named for George Wright because of his pioneering spirit and his expansive, vision, is aimed at that sort of higher level. We don't manage parks, we don't run our own parks or anything. We try to provide the baseline. We try to support the creation of the baseline of information that makes good management of those places possible. So we do that in a couple different ways. We do it by convening people together. For years, we did a biennial conference. We're now segueing that into an annual workshop, which is we're going to be holding starting. We're launching a new series starting this October. So we get people together to share information in various ways, and we also publish a journal, which is called Parks Stewardship Forum. And we do that in conjunction with the University of California at Berkeley, Wright's alma mater. So we are publishing partners with the university, and it's what they call an open access journal, which means there are no paywalls. It doesn't cost anything. It's open. Everything is open, free to anybody who wants to just go on the website and use that scholarship. And so we publish a whole range of articles based or covering different aspects of what we call place-based conservation, because there's so many different names for like parks, conserved areas, protected areas, marine areas, historic sites, even museums. All of these things we call place-based conservation.
Sure.
Conservation is focused on particular special places. So we try to support that.
Sure. So, what are some of the current goals and things that you're working on specifically? I mean, maybe you can give us an example of something you're doing currently that helps the parks.
Well, we are reacting to the current administration and the moves it's been making since January. In fact, we anticipated that. What we've been doing, we've created a thing called the Stewardship Archive. And what that is we, after the election in last November, even before that, we were aware that the Trump administration that was just newly elected was very likely to want to put a stamp on the kind of information that's published on websites from the National Park Service and other kinds of federal agencies who manage lands and waters. Because in the first Trump administration, they had done that. They had taken away websites that talked about climate change because they were, didn't want that discussed, and they made various changes to websites. So one of the projects that we've been working on, and we've actually done sort of initially completed, is before the new administration came in, we organized a small team of people, including a couple of computer scientists, to go to websites from the National Park Service, from some of the kindred agencies that work on other kinds of protected areas at the federal level, like the U.S. Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which runs national marine areas,
Sure.
these kind of agencies, and pick up material and archive it, stuff about climate change, things about endangered species protection. We also, again, because we do the cultural resources side, we got a lot of material on that was highlighting history of people who have been underrepresented in American history, African Americans, LGBTQ communities, a whole range of that kind of information. So we just gather that up because it's free public information that we all paid for as taxpayers. It's all on government websites, and we just archived it so that there'd be a record of what that understanding of all those topics was prior to the new administration. And as unfortunately as we had expected, the new administration, almost from the very beginning, began to alter things on websites, taking away, aspects of websites that didn't agree with their political ideology, which is their right to do. They are the publishers of
Mhm.
all these websites when the new administration comes in. And every administration changes some materials on websites. It's not like it's just the Republicans do it. The Democratic administrations, when they come in, they do it, but not to the extent that this new Trump administration's done it. And they were telling people before the election that they were likely to do this. So we just simply got all this information, and now we have it. And so, sometime in the future, if the political pendulum swings back, that information will be there and available to anybody who might want to use it. Just as a snapshot in time of saying this is how the government, these different federal land and water managing agencies, this is how they looked at those issues at this point in time. So we've done that. That was quite a bit of work, but it was sort of an immediate response to what we knew would be, a change with the new administration.
Sure. So to some extent, maybe an unintended consequence is because the current political climate and the current administration believes that the kind of information you're describing should be done by private entities to begin with. So kind of when you step into the gap, collate, act as curators of this information, make it
Mhm.
available to the public. The administration says, well, that's where it should be in the first place, and government shouldn't be involved in doing that. So does that end up in the long term having an unintended consequence of taking that responsibility away from organizations like the National Park Service, NOAA, that you mentioned, and other federal agencies?
Well, I would say, I mean, our effort was simply to archive it. We
Mhm.
we certainly, as a small organization, don't have the capacity to continue any of that research. And
I
I
see.
would argue, and I think the George Wright Society's position is that the federal government is an irreplaceable component of doing all that kind of research. I mean, in theory, it's possible that it could all be offloaded to universities or to, private organizations, some other kind, or to nonprofit organizations. But and the amount I guess a lot of people don't realize how much the federal government has been involved in science over the last
Yeah.
probably since the New Deal, and and if you hear scientists, not in the conservation field, like in the medical profession or other areas, talk about what's been happening, they all, to a person, will say there's no replacing the federal government. So I would say the chance of that being an unintended consequence, I mean, the political argument could certainly be made, and it's legitimate in theory, but in practical reality, there's no replacing the federal government. And it certainly is the case with the kind of science we're talking about with parks, because there just simply isn't the capacity in universities to do that. There's a lot of university partners, and they're critical partners in a lot of the science that goes on in national parks. I don't want to, leave the wrong impression. They're absolutely essential partners, but there needs to be a core of federal people who are leading those studies, collaborating on those studies and ensuring that the studies there's continuity, between, because professors come and go, and you want to make sure that the timeline of these studies, especially long-term studies like inventory and monitoring studies, that's really essential to have somebody in the parks, overseeing that.
Well, certainly in other federal agencies as well. I was just reading an article where the U.S. Geological Surveyor is, of course, continues to conduct volcanic studies using different sound technology in the caldera area at Yellowstone National Park, and how
Mhm.
important that fundamental scientific information is, and how
Yeah.
it pays, and as we discussed earlier with the PCR test, how it pays dividends to society. So you really end up getting a tremendous return on
Oh, yeah.
investment because it is taxpayer dollars, the federal government, and they're investing this in research in the parks, and that in return creates information and knowledge, and that knowledge base is then used to hopefully uh, benefit society as a whole. And that's really
Mhm.
the story that needs to be told. And I think sometimes it gets lost in
Yeah,
all of this because they think we're just throwing money at scientists to go out and do fun stuff.
sure.
Uh, and that's a very short-sighted way of looking at it.
Mhm.
We discussed earlier, kind of offline, the need to maybe bring together some of the stakeholders to respond to what's going on with the current administration, and maybe take a more comprehensive approach, not to respond in a political sense or make this a political issue and just fight Republicans against Democrats, but to really bring a group of stakeholders together to begin to make the case about how important these efforts are, the science that's done in parks, and the need for the adequate staffing to manage our parks is concerned. So the society as a whole understands this, and we remind people of how important this is. So in that context, are you thinking of bringing stakeholders together as a convener around trying to help?
Mhm. Yeah, as you said, Don, we're discussing this in the run up to starting the podcast. But yeah, the George Wright Society's board of directors, which is the governing body of the organization, is right now considering ways for us to respond. And again, we're a very small organization. We're not a large, super well-funded organization. So in terms of coming up with a strategic response and a nonpartisan response, and that was really important that you said that because this all should be nonpartisan. The support for conservation, support for science, and there are plenty of people from all walks of the political spectrum who support that. It may not seem that way sometimes, but there are. And so the question is, can you get all these people together to make a response? And that may be something that George Wright Society helps do. We would probably not be leading it because again, we're not the largest organization out there. But I thought it was a really cogent idea that you offered when we were talking just before we started, the recording here. And I think it's something that sounds to me it sounds like it's essential because again, it has to be a strategic response. There's so much has been coming down the pike from Washington, from the administration. Uh,
Mhm.
and lots of people obviously are just sort of reacting to whatever is coming out day
Mhm.
by day, and it's been a fire hose, and everybody's aware of that. But now I think we've gotten far enough in where people have sort of gotten their feet back under them, and they can begin to think about a more strategic response. So I would like to see something like that happen, and I know you and I are talking about providing that idea to our board in a more formal way, and we'll see where it goes. But it seems like something that's necessary to do.
Yeah, well, we have the National Park Conservation Association, of course, the National Park Foundation. We have the Institute at UC Berkeley that John Jarvis, a former director of the National Park Service, I believe is on the board or
Hmm. Correct?
chairs that board. And then there are others at the University of California at Merced that has an organization as well. So there's certainly stakeholders that can come together around such an idea in a nonpartisan way and try to help um, people understand the importance of this and perhaps change the climate a little bit.
Yeah.
But back to the George Wright Society, what do you think's been your greatest accomplishment? I mean, over the 45 years, you guys have done some pretty significant things. In your mind, what's been one of the most important?
Oh, I guess we can't take credit for any legislation and any larger things like that. But it's one of the great things that has happened has been the enshrinement in federal law of a science mandate for national parks, and that came in a rather I guess it's hard to get your head around the titles of some of these laws. It was called the National Park Service Omnibus Management Act of 1998. And these omnibus bills are like big catch-all bills that Congress puts together on certain topics. And this one's on
Very
that.
well aware.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I'm sure you are, Don. Throughout your career, you've been dealing with all those. Anyway,
Yeah.
part of that law, even though it has this unwieldy title that nobody can remember, in that law, was a section that specifically directs the Secretary of the Interior without any fudge language. It doesn't say to the extent practical. It says the Secretary of the Interior is directed to provide the highest quality science that can be mustered on behalf of the national park system. We didn't write that bill. We didn't have anything to do with creating, the language of the bill, but all the groundwork that we helped lay for the importance of science was sort of crystallized in that bill. And so, even though I don't want to, George Wright said he can't take credit for that. We helped, just create the background that made that possible. And there were some other things that were going on in the late 1990s that also helped really solidify science as an important component of the national park system and the National Park Service. And over since that time up through the present day, they've been able to develop a pretty robust science program, and one that does, as I mentioned before, have a really large constellation of partners in academia and NGOs. And there's still more that needs to be done in science. But what doesn't need to be done is what's happening now, which is the threat of literally cutting off most of that science and getting rid of it. So, we have this challenge right now before us, a large political challenge. But there is a base that we, George Wright Study, helped lay that can be, now used to argue that this is really essential, that this science is essential. So I'm proud of, all the work that we did sort of in the background to make that possible. And hopefully we can help make the case now when it's sort of the darkest hour for science in the national parks, that we can't let that flame be extinguished. So that's what we're trying to do.
That's absolutely important. Well, I understand. Unfortunately, I mean, everybody retires eventually, but I understand you might be stepping down soon. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, I've I never thought I would spend most of my career in one organization. It's just the way it's worked out. I've spent most of my career with the George Wright Society, almost all my working career in conservation. And so it's been great. It's been a wonderful job. I've never ever once thought, oh my God, I got to go to work this morning. It's just been terrific because of the work that we do, and literally hundreds of people that I've gotten to work with and over the years. But it is all good things must come to an end. So, and it's definitely time for new leadership, and I'm getting to the age where I need to retire. So, yeah, I'll be probably leaving this position no later than about 3 years from now. So we're beginning to do a transition for that. I still hope I do work on our journal as I do a lot of editorial work on that. I'd like to continue that. I don't want to step away from the game entirely, but to put the organization in the hands of new leadership, younger leadership, it's time to do it. Because it's just you have to have a new infusion of ideas every once in a while at the top. So we're just getting ready for that.
I understand. So you mentioned journalism. So is that what's in store for your future? Are you going to maybe focus a little bit more on journalism, or are you going to travel and visit every national park in the
I'd
world?
like
In the
to.
world?
I'd love to do that. Probably not journalism per se, but I have written about parks over the years. Not necessarily for magazines or journals as such. I've done published a couple of books that have to do with national parks based on my experiences in that. And I'd like to perhaps I maybe have one or two more of those that I would like to loose upon the world,
Okay.
my wisdom, such as it is. So writing is possible. One of the possible things I'd like to do once I step away from this job.
Right. I always like to ask my guests, was there something in your life that was transcendent or changed you or made you look at the world, differently? I mean, sometimes we take life for granted and everything that we do for granted. We get up, we do our job, and even if we love it, like you were saying, you never think you're working a day in your life when you have a wonderful job like you do. But as you've gone on your journey, especially in conservation, has there been anything that happened that changed you, that was either an epiphany or made you look at the world differently?
Yeah, I guess it was almost an epiphany. I mentioned at the top of the podcast, sort of how I kind of gravitated towards conservation when I was, in college and just after. But the seed of that was planted, and this is very kind of a very sort of standard American story. The seed of that was planted when my parents took my three sisters and I, threw us in the back of a Ford station wagon with no seatbelts in those days, and they got a pop-up camper, and we did a big tour of the national parks out west. I grew up in Ohio, so we
Mhm.
went out west, and we went to all these big parks, including Grand Canyon. Well, my parents decided that they wanted to visit the north rim of the Grand Canyon, which is the least, their lesser visited side. It's a little
Right.
higher up, it's harder to get to, rather than the South Rim, which was, that sounded fine to us. And so we did. We were camping there. I think we spent a couple nights at the campground on the rim, in the North Rim. And my experience, or maybe my epiphany, was just we had a campfire. We were sitting around the campfire. It was a beautiful day, and the sun is setting, in the background. And I remember the smell of the pines that were sort of wafting up and down from the thermals of the campfire. I remember the sort of purplish light in the canyon, which you could sort of see through the forest and down, and just that kind of aesthetic experience. I'm sure a lot of people have had these kind of epiphanies. You think, "Wow, this is something special," and boy, I don't ever want to be without this. I want to be able to come back and have these kind of experiences. So, and people have those, people can have that in their backyard. It doesn't, you don't have to go to get it in a national park. But for me, that's one thing that I definitely remember. And that probably set the table that, maybe I was it was in the background when I was talking about, learning to, gravitating towards conservation later on. So, it was just a national parks moment.
Right. No, I understand. Well, you and I had a similar experience, though. We migrated to California when I was 5 years old, and one of the stops we made, and I still have photographs of this, was on the rim of the Grand Canyon.
Oh,
Of course, that's 5 years old. I don't know if it was the north or south, but I did
sure.
spend my 62nd, or well, my 67th birthday on the north rim of the Grand
Nice.
Canyon. And
Oh,
many
yeah.
people don't realize how beautiful and
Oh,
wonderful that the north
it's
rim of the
it's
Grand Canyon
incredible.
is. And I tell people all the time, that's where you should go.
Somehow my parents, they must have gotten that word because they said we want to go to the North Rim, and like you just said, Don, the drive down from Jacob Lake, all of that is it's incredible. But I mean, I've had wonderful experiences. I worked at Valley Forge. I was a seasonal for a couple of years. I worked at Valley Forge National Historical Park during the fall, so it was like, not the highest. After the fall color season was over, I was out there in Washington headquarters, just tending the site. And I remember sitting in that place on a very cold November afternoon, and you're dressed up, in 18th
Right.
century, garb, because that's what you do when you're an interpreter there, and looking out over there and thinking, just getting just a taste of, like, man, how must it have been for them in that winter when they were there at Valley Forge. And you sort of connect to history, when you just stand there for a while in these places, and it gives you a better sense of what the whole country has gone through. And so, you can have hundreds of these kind of moments when you go to parks, and you can have them at your local park. You can have them anywhere, but you just have to be ready for them.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned it gives you a sense of what this country's gone through. And I think that kind of history and understanding is what the National Park Service has evolved to be all about, not just the 63 parks that we think of as the icon parks, but the system as a whole, telling the story of America, of the United States of America, I should say. I lived in South America, and if I said I was an American, they would look at me funny and say, "What are you talking about?" You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
and
for sure.
this is America. And
Yeah, yeah,
so
yeah,
so
right.
that's why I was saying United States of America,
Sure.
telling that whole story about the United States of America, and
Yeah,
getting people to really understand their heritage and their history, both in a natural and a cultural sense. It's extremely important.
yeah,
Dave,
that's what it's all about. Yeah.
thanks for joining me. This has just been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it. And I really hope to continue our conversation about convening the stakeholders, and you may be presenting this idea to your board, and let's see where it goes. Thank you very
Oh,
much.
yeah. No, thank you, Don. I definitely will be doing that. I want to thank you for the podcast that you've been putting together. I've dipped into a couple episodes. I love your just the spirit of exploration that's in these things. It's wonderful, and so I congratulate you and thank you for doing it.
Great. We'll talk again soon. Thanks, Dave.
That's good. Thanks. Bye bye.
Bye-bye. What a great conversation. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you got a sense of how important it is to conduct science in our national parks, and that you also gained an appreciation for organizations like the George Wright Society. Please subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. You can also become a member at Patreon by going to our website at natureandsciencepodcast.com. When you sign up, you'll receive a free Nature and Science coffee mug. As always, stay safe, share happiness, and remember, never stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.